Awesome. For folks who are new to JUFJ, we organize and mobilize Jews and allies to move our region closer to social, racial, and economic justice by advancing campaigns that result in immediate and concrete improvements in people's lives. You can learn more about our mission and values on our website, which Hannah is going to post in the chat if she hasn't already. And if you haven't, please introduce yourselves in the chat, include where you live if you want, what pronouns you'd like us to use for you, and what you want to learn about the DC budget or budget season in this session. To go over a little bit of what our plan is for the rest of the night. Tonight, we're going to be covering the DC budget. If you joined us last week or at our politics crash course in October, we talked a lot about all of the other parts of DC politics, including some history, information on the council and council members, how a bill becomes a law, and local elections. What we didn't cover is DC budget, so that's what we're doing tonight. We are going to be covering a lot of ground because we want you all to have a solid foundation as we move toward taking action this budget season. This is going to be a little bit frontal. There will be opportunities for interaction though, but we are going to be talking to you and at you quite a bit. So just a heads up there. We'll also pause periodically for questions, but please feel free to put them in the chat if you'd like as we go along, and we'll do our best to get to them in the moment. And I'll pass it back to Hannah.
Awesome. Thanks, Jenna, and thanks everyone for joining us. My name is Hannah Garlick. I use she, her pronouns. I'm also one of JUFJ's DC community organizers, and I live in Ward 1. So before we get started, I'd love for folks to put in the chat as you're also introducing yourselves to let us know some of the public services or things that you really appreciate or care about making sure the DC government funds in its yearly budget. And as folks who are putting like that information in and what you care about, for us, a lot of the things that we care about at JUFJ is things like housing vouchers. So our neighbors who make very low incomes can make their rent and revenue so that we can fund birth to 3 and make sure everyone in the district has affordable early childcare and educators are paid fairly. Before we really get into the nuts and bolts of the DC budget, we want to make sure that we're really clear that budgets are moral documents and it's a reflection of our city's values. What we fund is what we value. When the DC budget makes it possible for extremely wealthy people to get hundreds of millions of dollars in tax cuts, as it did a few years ago, but our elected officials say they can't find the funds to make sure everyone has access to safe and stable housing, that says something loud and clear about where our government's priorities are. Budgets matter because they affect people's lives in fundamental ways. They determine whether there are enough services for our homeless neighbors, libraries in our communities, or violence interrupters. They also write some of the things that I'm seeing here about public transportation and buses, making sure that we have funding for things like that. And as folks are thinking about the things that they care about for funding, please put that in the chat. We'd love to see it. Budgets are really where our politics meet reality. Policymakers may say that they're with you, but budgets are one of the places where the rubber meets the road. Some people say that budgets force a competition between limited resources, that there's only so much money coming in, so there can only be so much money going out. So for example, the absolute essential early childhood educators will get the raises they deserve in order to be adequately compensated for taking care of children so parents can continue to do their jobs during the pandemic. But if we do that, then there isn't enough money to make sure everyone who wants a permanent home has one. We refuse to pit key programs against each other, and we reject assertions that the only way to increase funding for one important priority is to cut or inadequately fund another. So we know that budgets are moral documents, and we work throughout the budget season and really kind of all year round to make sure our elected officials see it that way as well. And I'm also just noting, I see a lot of folks are continuing to put things into the chat about what they care about. So affordable housing vouchers, traffic infrastructure, DC public schools, environmental justice, things like that, education, some really great things, libraries, affordable housing, a lot of really wonderful things in the chat. And I'm gonna now pass it to Sarah.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay? I had to switch to my phone to make sure that my internet doesn't cut out while I'm talking. It's nice to see you all tonight. My name's Sarah Novick. I use she, her, hers pronouns, and I am the DC director at JUFJ. It is a pleasure to be with you all. Yeah, thanks, Jenna. We are gonna go over some budget basics, revenues, expenditures, surpluses, deficits, what the components of DC's budgets are, so the foundational stuff to get us started. So first, revenues and expenditures. Revenue is the money the city collects through things like taxes and fines and many different kinds of fees. And you'll see on the right, expenditures are the funds that the city spends on services and programs and capital projects. One of the funny things about a municipal budget is that the future year's budget gets set based on revenue projections, how much money it's expected DC will bring in. So obviously that's based on a ton of factors, predictions about how much DC's revenue streams will generate, those are made, and what the council uses to put together the budget. And that's what the council uses to put together the budget, or their planned expenditures. We'll go into surpluses and deficits just to continue to set the stage. You may have seen in the news recently that DC has a surplus of funds from FY21, which ended last September. Which means that the city brought in more than what was projected it would and more than it actually spent over the course of that fiscal year. The CFO, or DC's Chief Financial Officer, made an announcement last week that DC has a surplus of $576 million for FY21. So what happens with that money? By law, whenever there's a surplus in DC, it first has to go to filling the district's reserves, which are a number of different pots of money that can be used in really dire moments. And there's very specific rules and regulations for each of those about how they can be spent and what they can be spent on, and how they need to be, how quickly they need to be, how quickly the funds that come out need to be replenished. And once the reserves are full with the surplus, they can then be split between two different places. The first is the Housing Production Trust Fund, which is DC's primary fund for developing affordable housing. And then the other half goes to capital projects, or what we call PAYGO, which stands for Pay As You Go. And those are one-time payments on infrastructure projects. So we're going to talk about advocacy around the budget and the surplus in a little bit, but as you're thinking, I can see all the wheels turning about all the ways that DC could use that $576 million. It is important to keep in mind that that can only be spent on one-time projects because it's not recurring revenue. So it can't pay for ongoing services and programs. And Hannah is sharing a link in the chat with some information from Martin Ostermule on just update on the surplus from the CFO. On the other hand, a much less ideal case is when there's a budget gap. And a budget gap is when the revenue, the money coming in, is less than what was spent, or the expenditures. So how might that happen? How does a budget gap or a deficit happen? And it happens because the revenue that was collected could be lower than what was originally expected, or because expenditures are higher than what was expected to happen, or both. And it might be hard to think back, but if you were in DC at the beginning of the pandemic in the spring of 2020, and again, can remember that far back, there were concerns about how the district's revenue streams were going to be impacted, and how the city was going to respond to some of the unforeseen costs, like increased unemployment insurance and support for small businesses, just to name a couple things, due to the needs that came out of the pandemic, so the city wouldn't fall into a budget gap. So that's just to like root us in some recent history. And I saw, Catherine, you asked a question, how many years in a row we've had a surplus? It's been a few years at least. It has been a few years. We're going to get more into this, but it is not allowed for DC to have a deficit. So we always, unless, you know, we're not ever going to spend, you know, every single dollar the way that they say that we say it's going to be spent. So we often have a surplus, and I don't know how many years, but it's been many years. You're absolutely right. Okay. Speaking of which, slide 7 we're here. Thank you, Jenna. The DC government needs to have a balanced budget. So some states and cities and our federal government can run a deficit, meaning they can spend more than they have, but DC's budget has to be balanced. It's in the DC charter. So that means that the revenue has to be equal or exceed our expenditures. Okay, so the DC budget is divided into 2 parts, the operating budget and the capital budget. The operating budget allocates resources to run the government day-to-day, like salaries of city workers and health expenses for residents in the district health programs. And then on the capital budget side, those costs, that budget contains the costs associated with building and maintaining infrastructures like roads and schools. And then just to note at the bottom, DC's fiscal year runs from October 1st through September 30th, whereas our neighbors in Maryland and Virginia start their fiscal year on July 1st. Any questions on our basics? And I see Michaela, thank you for the note. I assume the budget surplus and one-time payment mentioned differs from the COVID relief funds. Yes, the COVID relief funds, I think you're referring to the federal funds that the district received, and those were different. Absolutely. Any other questions? Okay. Well, if you have them, please put them in the chat, and otherwise I'll hand it over to Hannah.
And to also put more things in the chat, or if someone wants to unmute and let us know, if you know, does anyone know where DC gets its money? So feel free to put in the chat or unmute and share with us.
From taxes? I mean, didn't we just talk about that? And service fees and fines and all that jazz?
Totally. Yeah. Thanks for renaming it, Janine. Awesome. Yeah, the district receives money from a lot of different places. So we're going to start first with, right, you see here, there's local funds, federal grants, enterprise funds. So we're going to dive into those pieces just a little bit. So the district receives federal funds like other states and cities. DC receives funding from the federal government. Sometimes they're in matching funds, so the district and the federal government share expenses, and others are fully funded grants from the federal government. And one of the largest share of federal funds goes to support our Medicaid program. And then there's also other forms of income and special purpose revenues and dedicated taxes. So these are taxes that are designated for specific use and from specific uses, from specific places. So for example, the district has a nuisance abatement fund and collects fees and fines from property owners who violate building codes. And then there's also enterprise funds or dedicated taxes and user fees for quasi-government agencies like paid family and medical leave, which operates at a 0.62% quarterly payroll tax on employees' total wages, which then go into the collective pot for DC workers to have access to paid parental, family, and paid sick leave. Most of DC's money comes from local funds, which is us. Local funds come from district-based taxes, which is great because that means that DC gets to decide what to do with the revenue from local sources. Can someone unmute or put in the chat if you know the 3 main types of taxes there are?
property tax.
Yeah, thanks, Gail. We have property tax. There's two others. Does anyone know? Sales tax? Yeah, thanks, Charlotte, for putting that in the chat.
Income.
Yes, awesome. Thanks, Wally and Charlie in the chat. Yes, everyone is on it. So our next slide shows our local funds that are generated from tax revenue. And the three main types of taxes: property, income, and sales tax. And they're one of the major ways that we are able to fund our programs in DC. And I'm going to turn it back to Sarah.
Great. So as we said at the beginning, budgets are moral documents. Our elected officials make choices about how to spend our tax dollars, which may or may not reflect our personal values. Another way that we see our values reflected or not in our city budget is how our taxes are structured. And our tax structure can also reflect our values and if we're working towards a more equitable city. So to say this very simply, as you see on your screen, tax justice is racial justice. So we're going to talk about taxes and tax policy briefly. It's not the focus of tonight, but we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about it a little bit. Tax policy is not race neutral. Discriminatory public policy and racially prejudiced public and private actions of the past contributed to a context in which, a current world in which Black people and other people of color were and still are systematically cut out, held back, or forced to the margins. And in that kind of environment, state and local tax policies often deepen the profound challenges that people of color have faced, even and sometimes especially when those tax policies were not explicitly race-based, when they were race neutral. So there are regressive and progressive taxes. Can someone put in the chat or unmute an example of a regressive tax that we pay? Alex's payroll tax. Sales tax. Yeah. So taxes are regressive if they require every single person, regardless of how much money they make, to pay the same amount, like sales taxes or payroll taxes. Everyone pays the same amount. Regressive taxes take a larger share of low and middle income taxpayers' income than from high income taxpayers. Or another way to say it is lower and middle income residents pay a higher proportion of their income on the same $10 t-shirt than a high income resident pays. Property taxes, for example, in DC are also regressive. DC's lowest income families pay a higher percentage of their income on property taxes than higher income families. And for folks who rent, property taxes get passed on in your rent. Sometimes, less frequently, taxes are progressive or have progressive features. Can somebody identify an example of a progressive tax that we pay? Yeah, thanks, Charlie. Income taxes. Income tax should be the most progressive. An equitable tax system would look like a staircase. So a progressive, equitable tax system would look like a staircase with higher income taxpayers paying a higher percentage of their income. In DC, white residents on average have 3 times the income and 81 times the wealth of Black residents. I'll say that again, 81 times the wealth. And these gaps have widened in the pandemic as stock market gains increase the wealth of people who already had the most, namely in DC, white people, while unemployment and the loss of childcare have put thousands of poor and working class Black and brown families in situations where they're doing everything they can just to get by. And while many Black families have middle class income in our city, too few do. And Black and brown families are disproportionately struggling compared to white people. So to this day, DC is making racialized tax choices that leave our system lacking progressivity. And the government is protecting wealthy white people by not requiring enough of them, by not requiring that they pay their fair share. Beyond the problem of the tax system not being fair, it's also inadequate to raise the money needed to address racism and create equitable opportunities for Black and brown residents who have systematically been kept down. So just saying it very plainly, racism undermines two of the most important pillars of our tax system, both adequacy and equity. If you want to learn more about income and wealth inequality in DC, the Urban Institute put out a really incredible report a few years ago called The Color of Wealth in the Nation's Capital that Hannah just linked to in the chat. Thanks, Hannah. And it's from 2016, but it's still very, very relevant to today. Last summer, during the FY22 budget cycle, we did have a major tax win. DC Council voted to impose a marginal tax increase on residents making over $250,000 annually. I don't want to downplay that. It was and still is a huge deal. And it literally, it just moves the needle toward a more equitable tax structure. Those who have more are contributing more in order for DC to provide the funding for important human needs like housing vouchers and basic income for very low income residents, but it's still not enough. And I'll turn it back to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Sarah. We are gonna go into a Menti, which is a way to kind of share what we're thinking about a little bit. So we're gonna take just 2 minutes and put in the chat a Menti where we're gonna answer 2 questions. And if the Menti is difficult to get to, feel free to also just put the answers to the question in the chat. So I'm gonna put this link in the chat and then share my screen. And the first question that we're gonna answer is, if you were in charge, imagine you have the power, what are 3 things you would wanna spend most of the district's money on? And I'm gonna get our screen up so that we're able to all see what we're putting in here. Housing, education, healthcare. And again, if the Menti is difficult to get to, feel free to put it in the chat as well. Public transportation. I'm seeing a lot of repeats. Yeah. Thanks, everyone. Awesome. Thank you. Healthcare, housing, education, affordable housing, transportation, living wages, childcare, affordable childcare. I see some themes. Yeah, thanks, everyone. And now you should be able to do the next question, and we'll see if and just answering the question, what do you think DC actually spends most of its revenue on? We'll take a minute for folks to add in what you think DC actually spends its money on. Infrastructure, education, housing, policing, tax breaks, healthcare. Some similar themes. We're seeing a few new words come up. Yeah. And I'm seeing also in the chat, employee salaries, policing, fire, education, bids, yeah, capital, education, business development. So I if folks are hearing, in the first one, we were hearing a lot of like human services, and this one I'm seeing a little bit more on some of the like other pieces of DC, like tax breaks and things like that. Awesome, thanks everyone. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen, and we're gonna go back to the slides and talk about how DC spends its money. So like every city, DC has a lot of expenses. Human services are actually the biggest chunk of DC's budget. Public education, including both DC public schools and charter schools, are next. And following, the third largest chunk includes public safety and economic development, which include investments into affordable housing programs and workforce development. And like we talked about a little bit before, there's a lot of competing asks in a budget. However, there's the sense that there's not enough money, especially for programs and human services, doesn't actually match what we see in our budgets and the wealth we know has accumulated in the city. Thinking back to what we just talked about a little bit, and thinking about how we can use our taxes as justice. So now that we've talked a lot about how the budget works, we're going to kind of move into the process of the budget and how we fight to make it reflect our values and priorities.
But before we get to that, we're going to talk about the different budgets that we talk about during budget season. And actually, there's one that didn't make it on the slide. Apologies about that. I'll start there. There are four budgets that the DC government will have discussed and negotiated over the course of the next few months. You see on your screen the Local Budget Act, the Budget Support Act, the Federal Portion Budget Request Act, and we failed to add the Supplemental Budget. So starting there with what's not there, the Supplemental Budget allows for revisions to be made to the current fiscal year's budget. So we're not planning on focusing much on the Supplemental Budget this year, so I'm not going to go into much more detail than that, but you should know that that exists. And then there's the Federal Portion Budget Request Act, and that includes funds appropriated for the district for specific purposes, like we mentioned, things like the federally operated DC court system and our Medicaid and things like that. Again, this year we're not planning on focusing much on the federal funds that we're getting, so not going to spend a whole lot of time there. But we are this year and generally focus the most on the Local Budget Act and the Budget Support Act. So for the LBA sets is the budget for each government agency and program. That's the one that has the charts and the line item funding allocations in it. And then the Budget Support Act is the legislation that discusses any budget changes that also require a change in law. So that can be a change in taxes or a change in eligibility for a specific program, or a way to spend the money that was added to the LBA. Questions about the LBA or the BSA before we move on to the next slide? Okay, Hannah.
So we're going to talk a bit about who's who and where the power lies when we talk about budget. So we're going to look and talk a little bit about some of the big power holders and where we have ability to influence moving folks and who is the most responsive to advocacy. So starting with the CFO in that bottom left corner, the Chief Financial Officer, Dr. Fitzroy Lee. And so the CFO is independent, but has significant influence on how finances are used, and we have little power to influence or advocate. The CFO tends to be very conservative in the revenue forecast to ensure that there's no budget gaps, because remember, DC can't have a budget gap or a deficit. And that's why we've been seeing so frequently that we have a surplus, because he's very conservative in the way that he influences the budget. Then we'll move to the mayor, just above the CFO. Right now, the current mayor, Mayor Bowser, has significant influence and power over the budget. However, she's difficult to influence and lobby, and we don't really have her ear, and she doesn't always listen to the voices of advocacy groups. Then we move to the right there, the chair of the council, right now, Chairman Mendelson, and he takes the responsibility to have a balanced budget very, very seriously. And we're gonna just look back at a little piece of history right now. In 1994, the city started running a deficit, and over the course of the year, the deficit increased to $722 million, and the district's bond rating was dropped to junk status, which indicated to lenders that lending to the district was really risky. And without the ability to borrow money, DC couldn't pay its bills. So in 1995, Congress decided to create a financial control board, which was given pretty broad responsibility to balance the district's budget, including things like approving or rejecting annual budget, its financial plan, attempts to spend or borrow money in the city's name, review future or current city contracts. Obviously, this list went on and on for a pretty broad control. And the control board did do some helpful things for the district, though. And one of the main reasons why DC ended up in a deficit was because even though DC functioned as a state and paid for Medicaid, hospitals, public education, roads, courts, and prisons, the federal government at the time wasn't always treating DC like a state. So it wasn't giving DC the full subsidies, it was giving other states for things like Medicaid and operational funding for public schools. So the control board helped fix that. But the chairman evokes the memory of the control board by saying we can't fund all the services we think are essential because it wouldn't be prudent. And if you want to have a deeper dive, we recommended last week the book Chocolate City. There's a lot about the control board in there. Would definitely recommend, even if you only have time for that chapter. It's definitely worth it. And so Chairman Mendelson has a lot of power over the budget because he has final say what goes into the council version of the budget. And then right under Chairman Mendelson, we have DC Council. And council members have less control over the budget. They have more control over legislation. However, they're easier to get in touch with, talk with, and influence. And so DC Council is where most of our budget advocacy lies. And definitely not least, if Jenna just clicks the next slide, that's us. And it's a little cheesy, right? But we as residents and advocates have a lot of power in sharing how we want to see our values represented in our budget. Through advocacy to the council and grassroots advocacy in our own communities, we're able to shift the consciousness and change the narrative and make our values and morals clear. We hold a lot of public power and we are powerful people. And that is really important. And so that's why we matter in the budget process as DC residents. And now we're going to go, Sarah's going to take us through the council budget process.
Yes. If you were with us at our session last week, we talked about how the DC Council has three kind of main roles: policy or legislative, oversight, and budget. We spent a lot of time last week talking about their legislative role, and tonight we're going to talk a lot about their oversight and budget roles. So there are two kind of, like, I like to think of two phases to the budget. There are much more components, and we'll get into those, but I think about budget as two phases. The first is agency performance oversight, and the second is budget oversight. So as you see on the right side of your screen, performance oversight hearings come before budget allocations for the coming fiscal year, and council uses that time to review all of the agency's operations and effectiveness in implementing their budgets over the past year. And they do that by asking agencies questions in writing, which the agencies are required to answer in writing, and they also answer questions in oversight hearings. And hearings are also available to the public. So residents, advocates come talk about experiences with the agencies through their programs or services. It's a really important time for people who are receiving services and advocates who are working with folks who receive services to give feedback to the council, so council can do the oversight work that is part of their job. The other big phase of the season is budget oversight hearings, which are another opportunity for council to ask agencies questions, which again, they are required to answer. And it's also an opportunity for us to come and make requests for funding allocations. So in our next slide, welcome to budget season. This is a pretty comprehensive overview of the major dates and general timeframes for this year's budget season. And I just want to highlight a few of those dates. So I'm going to move the chat box out of the way so I can see it. Budget is happening all year long. The mayor and the executive branch are creating their budget plans in the fall. They finalize their budgets in the winter. So that on the administration side has been happening for months. And we're coming in kind of more, we're kind of coming in the middle. As you see, the yellow bar at the top is performance oversight hearings. Those started this week. And they are, as we said, as I said just now, important moments for folks to tell council their experiences with what is happening with programs so council can do oversight. Next on the list is the Mayor's Budget Engagement Forums. Historically, these have been really great moments for JUFJ and our partners and allies to show up and share our priorities. The mayor comes, her deputy mayors come, the heads of agencies come. Since the pandemic, the ability for us to advocate, she has had engagement forums, but they have been very frontal and haven't. They've been virtual, not in person. And so we haven't had the kind of way to impact the conversation at those that we have previously. So we'll see if that is a pressure point again this year. We don't know yet. And we are hoping to see the mayor's proposed budget released on March 16th. That's the date that we were given. Hopefully it won't get pushed back like it has in the last couple of years. And then once that proposal gets released, that moves us into budget oversight hearings. So for our purposes, that's another opportunity for us to come out and talk about why money should be spent in the ways that we think it should be spent. And we'll go into markups and votes and all that stuff in a minute. On this slide, great. So as I just said, the mayor transmits her proposed budget. She does that as a single document, and then it goes through a committee process where, it goes through a committee process before it goes to the chairman, who can make changes, which then gets revealed to the council about a day before the first vote. Yes, the council, their staff, and the entire public get generally less than 24 hours to read the whole budget, which is a 500+ page document before it gets voted on. So before we talk about how outrageous that is, we're going to break down how the budget moves through the council. So after the mayor's proposed budget drops, each of the council committees holds hearings, budget oversight hearings, for each of the agencies in their jurisdiction to hear from the agencies themselves and the public about their funding requests, as I just said. Then the committee chairs are responsible for marking up or making changes to their portion of the mayor's budget. When committees are doing that, they can shift funds from one program to another, or from one agency to another, as long as the agencies are in their own jurisdiction, but they can't propose spending more money than what was in the mayor's proposed budget for the agencies in their jurisdiction. The exception to that is that they could create a new source of revenue, or they can get funds transferred from another committee. So you see here, budget hearings go to committee markups, money gets moved around, and then there can be inter-committee transfers. And then after committees finish their budget, the chairman has about a week to put the whole budget back together. And in that time, he can move money between agencies and committee jurisdictions, and he and his staff, we've seen in the past, are often able to find small pots of unspent money to meet small funding gaps, which is one of the big reasons why the chairman always is at the top of our target list, because he has so much power over the final budget product. So like I said, he releases his final version of the budget about a day before the first vote, which gives folks very little time to read over the budget in its entirety. And it really puts council members in a position in which they generally have to vote without the ability to read the entire thing. Just as an aside, I think to myself, why hasn't anybody done this before? Well, Councilmember Che, the Ward 3 council member, led an effort almost a little over a year ago, just a few days over a year ago, to require the chair to submit budget recommendations by 48 hours before the first vote. This was in response to, in 2020, that he sent the council members the budget at 6 p.m. the night before the vote. But her bill failed, her attempt to change the council rules failed 6-7. I don't think they're planning on trying to change that again anytime soon, but there was an effort. Again, this is part of the reasons why the chair of the council is always a top priority for our advocacy. Alex, I knew somebody was going to ask who was against, and I didn't have time before tonight to look that up, but I will find the answer to your question, because I also want to know. So then after the chairman releases his proposed budget, we get to the first vote. So at the same legislative meeting, the council votes on both the Local Budget Act and the Budget Support Act. And it's important that both of those documents are being voted on at the same hearing, because we need them both available in case there are amendments. So you can simultaneously move the dollars around and identify in the Budget Support Act where the money should go and why, and both of those documents just really go hand in hand. So in case you missed our first crash course, every piece of legislation that goes to the council gets voted on twice. DC's legislative branch is a unicameral body. There's no House-Senate split. So to implement a system of checks and balances, the council is required to vote on each bill twice in order for that bill to pass. The idea there is that changes and amendments can then be introduced between votes. So again, as a system of checks and balances. And that is also applied to the budget. So the budget also gets voted on twice. So for second votes, the LBA and the BSA move separately. So they have their second votes on different days. And just so you know, even though there isn't a ton we can do to influence them after they're voted on the first time, we still generally engage in advocacy to make sure that if there was an amendment that was passed during the first vote that we supported, that those council members continue to support it in the second vote, that kind of thing. Alex, if you discover who was against it, please share it in the chat. And Hannah, I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay, I also want to open if there's any questions that folks have. I know that we just threw down a lot of information. So if folks have any questions, feel free to ask, unmute, or put them in the chat. and you can always follow up afterwards, and I'll just assume that we've answered every single question ever, and we'll move into mobilizing and the doing.
Okay. I have a question.
Perfect.
I guess my name is Janine McCann. I got kicked out of the my Zoom, so I'm coming in by phone now. A lot of times I hear that money has been put in the budget for specific things, you know, and the city doesn't spend it. And it's many times it's for people who are in real need of these services. And what happens with that? You know, at the end of the budget, does it, you know, I guess we just lose it? I think this has a little bit to do with the whole issue of performance. You know, how are these different, you know, programs being run, you know, so that they're efficient and can use the money?
Yeah, you bring up a really important point, and that's one of the reasons why we've been talking about agency performance oversight as part of budget season, because it really is important that that, just like you said, that they're efficient and able to use the money, but that we're also identifying places in the budget where money is no longer, which is not what you're saying at all, but money is no longer necessary, so we can reallocate it to other things that are that will be used and need to be used. But I'm with you. It is pretty outrageous every time I hear about you know, people being on the wait list for housing vouchers, and we don't have the capacity to. We have the housing vouchers, but we can't get that. This hasn't happened this year, but it has happened previously that we haven't been able to get all of the vouchers out the door. It's pretty outrageous, and I don't have an answer for you. I know it can like make me shake my fist at government, but I am. But that's why we engage. That's what we're doing here, to make sure that to make things stronger and better.
Yeah, because they could effectively kill it by just not hiring people to do the work, you know? Things like that. I often wonder about that.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your question, and thanks for calling back in. I'm sorry you were kicked out.
Yeah, my computer system is totally wacko.
Okay, well, we're now going to move into how we can take action, which I think is perfectly connected to the question you were just asking.
Yeah, and as we do that, I know that we have some budget advocacy pros in this Zoom room. So if folks can put in the chat and let us know about any budget advocacy you participated or done in the past. We'd love to see some of the things that folks have done here. And as we see some of the folks things that budget advocacy that people have done, we're going to share some of the ways to get engaged. And as I'm going to talk through this, we're going to put a commitment and evaluation card in the chat, so that as I'm sharing about all the different ways that people can be engaged, you can let us know what you're interested in doing, and we'll be sure to follow up with you. So that commitment card form, I'm going to put in the chat. And if you can pull it up as we're going through, that will be great. I think Sarah's going to put it in the chat, and I'm seeing her laughing about it, so I'm laughing a little bit. I'm also seeing some of the things that people have done. So Charlotte's contacted council members about funding for housing vouchers with the Way Home campaign, some of our partners. Catherine's done advocacy for tax and immigrant issues. Awesome. So as we're talking a little bit through, feel free to open up that commitment card and fill out some of the things you're excited about doing. So one thing that we do, I think should be on the next slide, is like action alerts and emails and calling council members and the mayor. And like we mentioned before, DC has a revenue surplus from fiscal year 21. And half of these funds are sent to the Housing Production Trust Fund, and the other half of the funds are to that capital projects or PAYGO, like we talked about. And we really think that some of those PAYGO funds should be redirected to other essential human needs. So we'll likely be doing some advocacy, especially towards the mayor, that those funds get redirected for rental assistance and eviction prevention programs like Stay DC that has run out of money, but they think we're getting some more money and be able to fill that pot, and some other support programs. So that's something that we'll likely be advocating for. Something that we might be advocating against is tax cuts. Like we talked about, tax is racial justice. We're all good. All right. And one of the issues with tax, when there's a surplus, there generally tends to be a call for tax cuts for businesses. So we believe that growing revenue should be used for enhancing public health protocols, meeting other human needs, and advancing racial and economic justice. So we haven't heard any groups make public calls for cutting taxes, but we and our partners will be paying close attention and monitoring that. There's also testifying at oversight and budget hearings and sharing stories and priorities. JUFJ doesn't always get involved in oversight hearings. However, this year, as part of the Under 3 DC Coalition, we'll likely be supporting our coalition partners by reading the testimony of undocumented early educators so that elected officials hear stories from educators and that those educators can continue to be protected from possible retaliation or legal punishment. And this is a way that we can be part of a strong coalition and build community within our coalition at Under 3. And testifying at budget hearings, right? One of the ways that we are able to really clearly tell council members how we want to see revenue used. And we expect our biggest budget ask to be for affordable housing and homelessness. We also meet with council members, directly sharing our priorities and getting them on the record with their position. So JUFJ has been meeting with council members for the past month or so, and we're going to continue to do so. If you've pulled up that commitment card, there's an opportunity to sign up for 3 meetings with council members. All of them are at-large council members: Robert White, Phil Mendelson, and Christina Henderson. So those are definitely a way to get involved and share our priorities. And also working with our working groups. JUFJ working groups are a great way to learn and get more involved. It's where we talk about council members' positions on current issues and legislation. We plan events and programs and actions, and we get much deeper into these priority issues and the funding. So for lack of just pitching this to all of you, I'm going to give my little elevator pitch about our working group so you can hear a little bit more about them. Our Under 3 working group works on, like we said, securing quality, affordable childcare for all DC families and higher wages for early childhood educators with the Under 3 DC campaign and coalition. So this working group is for you. If you're a parent of a young child, or you care about, or you know someone who's a parent of a young child, or you care about paying early educators fairly and working on racial and economic justice issues through the early education lens. Our housing security working group works on issues like preventing evictions and then strengthening and expanding DC's rent control program, working especially with our partners at Fair Budget Coalition, Reclaim Rent Control Campaign, Cancel Rent, and Way Home campaign. And if you want to be working on keeping DC an affordable place to live and helping DC residents stay in their homes or get access to housing, you should definitely come to our housing security working group. And finally, our economic justice working group, working on supporting a hopefully soon to be introduced domestic worker bill of rights, fighting for our surplus to be used for human services, and advocating against tax cuts. If you care or are interested in labor issues, fair taxes, and a more equitable city, you should definitely come to our economic justice issue. And we have a sister organization, the JUFJ Campaign Fund, also scores votes, including votes that happen during the budget process. And we're about to go into an election cycle. So if you're interested in holding council members accountable through elections, let us know if you're interested in working with our campaign fund. I'm seeing some responses come in through my email of people filling out their commitment form. I'm going to put it in the chat just one more time so folks have it. And I know that I've missed some things in the chat here. And Gail, yeah, Gail testified many times this year. Thank you so much for that. Awesome. I'm getting lots of emails. I don't know if you can hear the ping from my emails coming in. Thank you all for filling out those commitment forms. And Sarah's gonna close us out.
Great. So just to tie things up, we would love to hear one word that's coming to mind as you're thinking about the DC budget, your advocacy or your work on the budget this year or on the oversight process. Would love for you to share in the chat something that you're thinking about or taking away from tonight. And then if folks have additional questions, we are ending significantly early, so we can stick around for a little while if you have questions that we haven't addressed. I know, Kevin, I think I saw that you put something in there, but I'm failing to pull it up. So if you want to ask that question, we can dig in.
I'm just curious about what happens if the federal government has a continuing resolution. What's happened in past years when that, if it's a full year continuing resolution?
Yeah, that's a great question. I only recently started paying attention to the federal budget side because of the pandemic. So I'm happy to try to point you to some resources, but unfortunately, I don't have them off the top of my head to be able to share them right now.
Yeah, I'll take a look.
But we can get back to you, like some resources there. I think we're still filling out commitment cards because I don't see parting words in the chat just yet. So thank you for spending time on the commitment cards.
I have,
And
are you aware of what's going on in Ward 3 with the Wardman Hotel? Have you all heard about that?
Just a little bit, but I know there are some other folks on the call who live in Ward 3 who have more information about that than even I do. I don't know if you have a specific question about it or you just want to connect with other people.
Well, I guess the mayor has allowed this vendor, the construction guy, to put in their application to destroy the building, take it down. And they put it in just before Thanksgiving, and it expires the end of December, which means they can go ahead and, knock her down. And so I'm just wondering, in terms of oversight, to pull a stunt like that is, I was just shocked. I mean, because this is, and we don't even know what they're going to put up. They're just saying they want to take it down. We have not a clue as to what the plan is. So I am, just chewing nails, so to speak. I just thought when we take a look at performance, I'm having to rethink the mayor on this topic. I just, she's been very supportive in WIN, and when WIN does something, but there's something wrong here. And I don't know, in looking at the budget for the next year, I don't know, maybe this is more policy. How do we do things? I just wanted to throw it out there.
I've
Thank you.
been in the last couple of days to meetings with Ward 3 Housing Justice, and they're working very hard to raise the issue of the demolition. And
Yeah.
there is an upcoming meeting with the developer. So I would say if anybody's particularly concerned about the Wardman and turning it into affordable housing, connect with Ward 3 Housing Justice and get on their email list.
Okay. Yeah. I'm getting things from them, but I haven't heard about this meeting.
It hasn't been announced yet, but it's going to happen.
Okay. Well, that's good news. Sorry to sort of interrupt, but
Thanks,
good grief.
Agreed.
Yeah.
I mean, the
Catherine,
nice,
did you want to chime in?
well, I was gonna say the really nice thing about certain issues like that is we don't, I appreciate a good campaign, but you can call all the council members even without having a campaign. Like
Yeah.
it's so mind-blowingly bad, the Wardman situation, like so preposterous. Like it's a
Yeah.
great thing to call the mayor about every day.
Well, I've sent something to Che about it. So
And to Che, absolutely, and to
Yeah.
Che, yeah,
well,
yeah.
there's a lot of, well, there's just so much space there for creative housing. I mean, it's definitely possible to have all levels of housing, you know. I just, sorry.
Are you, just out of curiosity, are you also going to the housing working group meetings? Because they really do so much interesting work on housing.